The trunk arrived on the morning stage before the woman herself did, and Cecil Dalton stood in the dust of Caldwell, Kansas, staring at that battered old thing like it might speak to him if he waited long enough. It was the summer of 1878, and the plains of southern Kansas burned gold and amber beneath a sun that showed no mercy to man nor beast. Caldwell sat right on the edge of what folks called the Kishom Trail country, a town that smelled of cattle and ambition, and the particular kind of loneliness that only wide open spaces can produce in a man who has been working them alone for too many years. Cecil Dalton was 31 years old, broad across the shoulders from a decade of ranching, with hands calloused thick as saddle leather, and eyes the color of the Kansas sky in late autumn, a gray-blue that could be gentle or fierce depending entirely on what the day demanded of him. He had placed the advertisement himself, 3 months prior, in the Caldwell Post and in a Cincinnati paper whose name he could barely remember now. He had paid $2 for the notice, which had felt like a considerable sum at the time, and he had written the words himself at the kitchen table of his ranch house with a stub of pencil and considerable difficulty, because Cecil Dalton was not a man who found words easy. Rancher, 31, in good standing, seeks woman of sound character and steady disposition for marriage and partnership in honest work. 2,000 acres, good water, decent house. Respond to Cecil Dalton, Caldwell, Kansas. He had not expected many responses. He had received 14, which had both embarrassed and alarmed him. His friend and neighboring rancher, Pete Holbrook, had read through them all at Cecil's kitchen table, helping him sort them by what Pete called prospect, and what Cecil privately called the terrible weight of choosing a person. Most of the letters were pleasant and careful. 2 were from women with children already, which Cecil had set aside not out of objection but out of uncertainty. 1 was from a woman in Missouri who wanted to make it absolutely clear she was not prepared to cook, which had made Pete laugh so hard he'd knocked over his coffee. And then there had been Annie Kingsley's letter. It had been different from the first sentence, though Cecil could not have said precisely why, and he had read it so many times since that the paper had gone soft at the folds. Annie Kingsley was 24 years old, from Columbus, Ohio. She had written in a clear, unhurried hand without excessive flourish, and she had said the following: "I am not a woman who will pretend to be other than I am in order to secure an arrangement, so I will tell you plainly. I am capable and willing. I am not afraid of hard work or hard weather. I have some education and strong faith, though I will not press either upon a man who hasn't asked for them. What I want, if I am to be honest, is not merely a situation but a life. I don't know if you are a man who understands the difference, but I suspect you might be, or you would not have written what I stand on honest work." He had read those words the first time and sat very still for a long while after. Pete had noticed. "That one's different," Pete had said. "Yes," Cecil had said simply. He had written back to Annie Kingsley that same night. And now, 2 months of correspondence later, careful letters, honest letters, letters that had grown from practical to something he could not quite name. The trunk had arrived on the morning stage, and the afternoon stage was expected to bring Annie Kingsley herself. The trunk was not large. That was the first thing Cecil noticed. It was not the grand armoire-style trunk of a woman who thought she was coming to luxury. It was practical, medium-sized, the wood scuffed and the brass clasps worn. The stage driver, a red-faced fellow named Bert, had set it down on the boardwalk in front of Hadley's Dry Goods with no particular ceremony. "Kingsley woman's effects," Bert had said, and moved along. Cecil had arranged to have it taken to the Caldwell Hotel, where Annie would stay her first 2 nights before, if everything went as he hoped and prayed in his unpolished, rarely exercised faith. They would travel together to the ranch and marry properly before the week was out. The local preacher, Reverend Samuels, had already been spoken to. Cecil stood looking at that trunk, his hat in his hands, and he thought about the woman who had packed it. He thought about what a person chose to bring when they were leaving everything behind. He did not open it. That was not his right, not yet, and maybe not ever unless she offered. He had the town's young errand boy, Tommy Garrett, take it over to the hotel, and then Cecil himself went to check on his horse, which was hitched outside the livery, and to wait. The afternoon stage was an hour late. Cecil waited on the bench in front of Hadley's store, his long legs stretched out before him, his hat pulled against the sun, and he had what he could only describe as a quiet crisis of nerves, which was not a thing he was accustomed to having. He had faced down a flooded creek with 100 head of cattle on the wrong side. He had ridden out a January blizzard in a dugout for 3 days with nothing but some salt pork and a dog named Rufus for company. He had buried his father out on the north pasture 2 years ago and kept the ranch running through his grief without telling a soul how hard it had been. Cecil Dalton did not typically suffer from nerves. But he suffered from them now, sitting on that bench, because the reality of what he had set in motion was coming toward him on a stage from Wichita, and it had a name and a face he had only seen in a small oval photograph. She had sent him dark hair, serious eyes, a mouth that was not quite smiling but looked as though it were considering the possibility. When the stage finally rolled in, trailing a rooster tail of dust down Main Street, Cecil stood up and put his hat back on and squared his shoulders and told himself that whatever happened, he would be decent. Whatever she was, he would be decent, because a man who had put out an advertisement and made a promise, even an implicit one, was obligated to honor it. The stage door opened. 3 people climbed down, a drummer with a case of samples who immediately began scanning the street for a hotel, an older man in a minister's collar who was apparently passing through, and then Annie Kingsley. She was not quite what the photograph had suggested, and she was entirely more than it had managed to capture. She was of medium height, dressed in a practical dark blue traveling dress that had seen some dust but was otherwise neat. Her dark hair was pinned up under a small hat. Her face was, he noticed this first somehow, before anything else alert. It was a face that was paying attention to everything around it without making a display of the fact. Her eyes, which in the photograph had appeared dark, were in person a warm brown that caught the afternoon light with something almost like amber in them. She stepped down from the stage and looked around with a composure that he suspected was costing her something, because he could see, just barely, the slight tension in her jaw that meant she was working at it. He walked toward her. "Miss Kingsley," he said. She turned and looked at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything, which was the longest moment Cecil Dalton had experienced since his father's last breath. "Mr. Dalton," she said. Her voice was steady, low for a woman's and careful. "Yes, ma'am," he said. And then, because nothing else came immediately to mind, and because she looked tired and the sun was brutal, "There's a hotel just down the way. I thought you'd want to rest before anything." "That would be very kind," she said. "Yes." He reached for her traveling bag, a small, soft-sided thing she held in her left hand, and she let him take it, which felt like the smallest and most significant act of trust he'd ever witnessed. They walked to the Caldwell Hotel together and did not quite know what to say to each other, and the silence was not comfortable, but it was honest, and that was something. The hotel proprietress, Mrs. Elva Combs, a stout and efficient woman who had seen everything Caldwell had to offer and remained unimpressed by most of it, showed Annie to her room. Cecil said he would call for her at 6 for supper, and Annie said that would suit her, and then the door closed and Cecil walked back down the stairs and out into the street and stood in the heat for a moment. He thought, "She is real." He had somehow not entirely believed it until this moment. He went to supper at 6, cleaned up as well as a man with a ranch to run could manage, his good shirt pressed, his boots about as clean as boots got in Caldwell that summer. Annie came downstairs in a different dress, a softer color, and her hair was a little different too, and he thought she looked less travel-worn and more herself, whatever that meant when you had only known someone from paper. They sat at a table in the small hotel dining room, which served a reasonable beef stew and cornbread and not much else, and they talked. It was different from the letters in the way that talking to a person is always different from reading their words faster, less controlled, with more room for things to go sideways, but also with more life to it. Annie Kingsley was, he discovered, exactly as direct in person as she had been in writing, which was both a relief and occasionally startling. "Can I ask you something honestly?" she said when the stew was half eaten. "I'd prefer it," he said. "What made you choose mine, out of all of them?" He looked at her across the small table. The lantern light was warm. Outside, someone was playing a fiddle somewhere down the street, which was ordinary enough for Caldwell. "You said you wanted a life, not just a situation," he said. "I thought that was the only reason to go to the trouble of the whole thing." She considered this. "And what is it you want, Mr. Dalton?" He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Same thing, I expect. Someone to build something with. The ranch is good land. It could be more. But a man working it alone," he stopped. He was not accustomed to saying things like this out loud. "It's lonely," she said quietly, without judgment. "Yes," he said. She nodded once as if that answer had settled something for her. "I should tell you," she said after a moment. "My trunk, it doesn't contain much. I didn't have much to bring. My mother passed last winter and my father 2 years before that. The house was sold to settle my father's debts." She said this plainly, without self-pity, but he could hear the weight of it. "I came with what was practical." "That's sensible," he said. "I brought my mother's Bible," she said. "And there is a letter in the trunk as well." She paused. "It's from my mother, written when she was ill. I haven't had the heart to read it all the way through yet. I got 3 lines in and couldn't continue." Cecil looked at her. Something about that hit him in a place he hadn't expected, the image of this woman alone on the other side of a letter she wasn't ready for. "You don't have to tell me about it," he said. "I know," she said. She looked down at her plate. "I wanted you to know I come with grief that isn't entirely finished yet." "So do I," he said. "My father 2 years ago, this ranch was his before it was mine." She looked up. There it was again, that quality of attention, as though she was really hearing him. "I think," she said carefully, "that we might suit." He almost smiled. "I think we might." He walked her back to the hotel after supper and said good night at the foot of the stairs, proper as anything. And he rode home in the purple Kansas dusk, feeling something that he did not immediately have a name for, though it sat in his chest like warm coals. The next morning he came back to town to take care of some ranch business. He needed to speak to the feed store about a delivery, and he passed the hotel on his way, and then, on an impulse that was entirely unlike him, he went in. Mrs. Combs informed him that Miss Kingsley had gone to take a walk. In Caldwell, in summer, early morning was the only pleasant time for such a thing, before the heat settled in like a decision. He found her at the edge of town, where the boardwalks gave out and the dust became the plain, standing looking west toward where the land rolled out flat and enormous and endless under a sky that was just beginning to go from pink to blue. She had her hands folded in front of her, and her face was turned into a small morning breeze. He stopped a few feet away, and she turned. "Mr. Dalton," she said, not surprised exactly, but as if she'd been expecting something and wasn't sure what. "I was in town for the feed store," he said. "I didn't mean to intrude." "You aren't," she said. "Come and look at this." He came and stood beside her and looked west. He had looked west 10,000 times from spots very like this one, but standing beside her, he looked at it differently. He tried to see it as she was seeing it, brand new, enormous, beautiful, and frightening all at once. "It's very large," she said. "Yes," he said. "In Ohio the sky is, well, there's always something in the way, a hill or trees or buildings. This," she gestured vaguely at the horizon, which was unobstructed for what appeared to be forever. "This takes some getting used to." "It does," he agreed, "but eventually it starts to feel like room instead of emptiness." She looked at him sideways. "Is that what it feels like to you, most days?" She turned back to the plain. A meadowlark sang somewhere in the grass, bright and liquid in the morning air. "I think I could love this," she said quietly, and he was not entirely sure she was talking about the landscape. They walked the town together that morning, which was not a large undertaking since Caldwell was not a large town, and he showed her the church, which was modest but solid, and the school, which currently had 12 students, and the general store, and the livery, and the various establishments that made up civic life on the southern Kansas plains in 1878. She asked good questions about the ranching, about the seasons, about water, about the nearest doctor, which was 15 miles in Wichita if you needed one urgently. She absorbed information with a seriousness that he found unexpectedly appealing. "Would you like to see the ranch today?" he asked. Before anything is decided. You should see what you'd be coming to." She accepted immediately, and he could tell she had been hoping he'd offer. The drive out to the Double D, which was what his father had called the ranch, and what Cecil had kept calling it out of habit and sentiment, took about an hour by wagon. Cecil had hitched up the wagon that morning in anticipation, brought out by the same impulse that had sent him looking for her at the edge of town. They drove through grassland that rippled in the morning wind like a quiet inland sea, past draws where cottonwoods grew tall and ragged, past the far northern pasture where he kept his beef cattle, a small herd by the standards of the big operations to the south, but healthy and growing. Annie watched everything. She asked about the grass, whether it was good grazing grass, whether the summer had been dry, what kind of winters came here. She asked whether there were rattlesnakes, which there were, and received that information without apparent distress. She asked about the Cheyenne and the Arapaho, peoples who had lived on these plains for generations, and whose situation had changed so drastically and unjustly in the past 2 decades that Cecil, who was not a man given to political opinion, felt the wrongness of it in a bone-deep way he couldn't fully articulate. He told her about it honestly, that the lands had been taken, that there were still sometimes encounters, that the situation was not simple and was not good, and that any man who told you otherwise was either lying or not paying attention. She listened to that with a seriousness that matched his own. "That's a terrible thing," she said quietly, "to be removed from your home." "Yes," he said, "it is." The ranch house appeared at the crest of a low rise, and he watched her face as it came into view. It was not a grand house. It was a solid, well-built house of stone and timber, with a covered porch along the front and a kitchen garden that was currently in a state of unfortunate neglect because Cecil had no talent for gardens and no time for them. There was a good barn, red-painted, and several outbuildings, and a windmill over the well that creaked companionably in the breeze. "It's good land," she said, which was exactly the right thing to say, and he knew it. She got down from the wagon and walked around, looking at things with a rancher's eye. He hadn't quite expected checking the kitchen garden with clucking disapproval that made him feel a flash of embarrassment, testing the pump at the kitchen sink, running her hand along the window frame to check if it was true, opening the door of the wood stove and looking in. She was thorough and unsentimental, and he liked it enormously. "The kitchen is workable," she said, which was high praise from her. He was beginning to understand. "The garden's in sorry shape," he admitted. "I noticed," she said, without cruelty. "That can be fixed." They sat on the porch and he made coffee on the stove, competent coffee, which seemed to surprise her slightly, and they talked about the practical arrangements of the ranch. He explained how the operation worked, the cattle, the 2 hired men he had during busy seasons, the relationship with the cattle buyers who came up from Texas, the rhythm of the year. And sitting on that porch in the dry, warm air, with the windmill turning and the cattle visible as small, dark shapes in the north pasture, Cecil Dalton felt something settle in him that had been unsettled for a very long time. He wanted this woman to stay. Not just because he was lonely, and not just because she was capable, though she was both and it mattered. He wanted her to stay because she was paying attention to his life as if it were worth paying attention to, and because she had told him the truth from the first sentence she had ever written to him, and because she had a letter in her trunk that she was too grief-stricken to read, and he understood that in his marrow. "Annie," he said, which was the first time he had used her Christian name, and she looked at him directly. "I know this is not a conventional situation. I know you have given up a great deal to come here, and I know that what I'm offering is uncertain, as most things are. But I would like for this to work. I would like to try to build something honest here with you, if that is something you want." She was quiet for a moment. A hawk turned lazy circles above the south pasture. "It is what I want," she said simply. He released a breath he hadn't known he was holding. "Then we'll speak to Reverend Samuels," he said. "When you're ready." "Tomorrow morning," she said, which startled a short laugh out of him, the first real one in what felt like a long time. They were married 3 days later in the small Caldwell church, with Pete Holbrook standing as Cecil's witness and Mrs. Combs from the hotel standing as Annie's, because Annie had not had time to make any other friends yet, though Mrs. Combs seemed genuinely pleased to be asked. Reverend Samuels read the words with the solemn efficiency of a man who had married a good number of couples on the frontier and knew what the institution demanded. Cecil held Annie's hand through the ceremony and felt the warmth of it, the realness of it, and thought, "This is a thing I will not waste." They drove to the ranch afterward, the two of them and all their things, and Annie's trunk went into the bedroom on the floor by the window, and that was where it stayed for some weeks. The summer became their apprenticeship in each other. Annie Kingsley, Annie Dalton now, though she made the change slowly, trying it out like a new pair of boots, turned out to be not just capable but formidably so. The kitchen garden, which Cecil had privately considered a lost cause, was replanted and tended with a determination that seemed almost personal. She had grown up watching her mother garden, she told him, and her mother had known what she was doing. She could bake. More relevantly, on a working ranch, she could cook for the hired men during the busy periods without appearing to consider it beneath her, and she learned the ranch's rhythms faster than he had expected. She asked questions until she understood, and then she did not ask the same question twice. She learned to ride better than she had ridden some in Ohio, but Kansas terrain was different, and within a month she was competent on Cecil's second horse, a steady roan mare named Bess who had the disposition of a particularly calm schoolteacher. Cecil, for his part, learned her rhythms too. He learned that she needed quiet in the mornings, not silence exactly, but calm. She would sit at the kitchen table with her coffee, and the morning light coming through the window, and she needed that time to herself before the day began. He learned that she was funnier than she appeared, dry and quick, the kind of humor that only showed up when she trusted you. He learned that she was deeply faithful, reading her Bible in the evenings, not ostentatiously but as a private practice, and that her faith was of the quiet, bone-deep variety that did not require an audience. He learned that she missed her mother. He could see it in small ways, in the way she sometimes went still when she was working in the garden, her hands pausing, her eyes going somewhere inward. In the way she kept the worn black Bible on the bedside table but sometimes just rested her hand on it without opening it, as if it were a connection to something she couldn't quite reach. The letter stayed unread in the trunk. He knew it was there. She had told him, and he did not press and she did not offer, and the trunk sat by the window and the summer turned to fall. It was October when things shifted. The first turning of the leaves on the cottonwoods in the draws, the first genuine bite in the morning air, the quality of light going from gold to something thinner and more careful. Annie had been quiet for several days in a way that was different from her usual morning quiet. It was an inward kind of silence that Cecil recognized, because he had worn it himself after his father died. Something was working its way to the surface. One evening after supper, he came in from checking on the cattle and found her sitting at the kitchen table with the old trunk open on the floor beside her chair and the Bible in her hands and a letter on the table in front of her, unopened. He stopped in the doorway. She looked up. Her eyes were dry, but the effort of keeping them that way was visible. "I think I need to read it," she said. "All right," he said quietly. "I don't know if I can do it alone," she said, and there was something almost shy in the admission which was unlike her. He crossed the room and sat down across from her at the table. He did not say anything. He just sat there, present, the lamp between them, the letter on the table. She picked it up. Her mother's handwriting on the outside, his name, Annie Kingsley, in a hand that was clearly older and shakier than Annie's own confident script. She turned it over and broke the wax seal that had kept it closed these long months. Her hands were not quite steady. She read it. He watched her face without watching her, in the way you do when someone is in pain and you don't want to intrude on it, but you want them to know they are not alone. He watched her throat work. He watched her press her lips together once hard. He watched her reach the end and fold it carefully back along its creases and set it on the table. She knew, Annie said. Her voice was even but raw at the edges. She knew she was going, and she wanted me to know that she was proud of me, that she wasn't afraid, that she wanted me to be brave and go and make something. A pause. She said she trusted me to know what was worth keeping and what was worth letting go. She said she stopped. He waited. She said that whatever home I made for myself, she would be there. That home isn't a place, it's what you carry with you. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the prairie grass with a sound like breathing. Cecil looked at the table. He thought about his own father, about the way grief sits in your chest like something too large for the space it occupies. And he thought about this woman who had packed almost nothing, who had brought a Bible and carried her mother's last words unread for 6 months, because she had not been strong enough and had needed to get strong enough before she could bear it. Something moved in him that he did not try to stop. He reached across the table and took her hand where it rested beside the letter. She looked up at him. Her eyes were bright now, and one tear made it past her composure and tracked down her cheek, and she let it, which told him she trusted him enough not to perform the effort of stopping it. She was right, he said quietly. You carried it, and you came here and made something. Annie looked at him across the lamplit table, her hand in his, the letter folded before her and the old Bible nearby, and something between them became something else, something that had been building since that first morning on the edge of town looking west, and she turned her hand in his and held it properly. I think, she said carefully, that I'm quite glad I wrote to you. So am I, he said. He got up from the table and went around to her side, and she stood. And it was the most natural thing in the world to pull her close, carefully, his arms around her and her face against his shoulder. And he held her while she let herself finish grieving the loss she had been carrying since Ohio. And he said nothing because nothing was needed. And outside, the Kansas night settled over the prairie, and the stars came out enormous and cold, and the windmill turned. After a while, she lifted her head. I'm all right, she said. I know, he said. She looked up at him in the lamplight. She reached up and touched his jaw with her fingertips, tentative, discovering. He kissed her then, for the first time properly, and she kissed him back without hesitation, and the whole long, careful architecture of their becoming came together in that moment and held. The winter that followed was hard in the way Kansas winters could be. A blizzard came through in January that lasted 3 days and piled snow to the window ledges, and kept them inside with the cattle moving anxiously in the barn and the wind screaming off the plains. Cecil had known this was coming. He had good stores of wood and food and feed for the animals. What he had not known, had not been able to calculate, was what it would mean to be snowed in with a person you were falling in love with. It meant everything. They played cards by the fire. They read to each other. Cecil's reading was slower and more deliberate than Annie's, and she was patient with it, never hurrying him, and he made his way through a novel she had brought from Ohio while the snow pressed against the windows. They talked in a way that people rarely talk who have other demands on their attention, long-ranging conversations about faith and doubt, about what they wanted, about their childhoods, about fear, about what it meant to make a life. Cecil told her about his father. It came out slowly, the way these things do, over the course of a long winter evening, but he told her about the man stern in some ways, tender in others, a man who had believed in this land with something close to religious conviction, and who had worked himself into an early grave trying to prove it worthy of that belief. He told her about finding his father on the floor of the barn, on a Tuesday morning in February 2 years ago, and about the 3 days after that when he had not spoken to a single person and had not known how to continue. Annie listened to all of this without flinching and without the particular kind of false comfort that people sometimes offer because they don't know what else to do. She just listened, and when he was done she said, "He sounds like someone who deserved to see what you've made of it." Cecil had to look away for a moment. "Thank you," he said, when he trusted his voice. By the time the blizzard let them out in late January, they were fully and irreversibly in love, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so directly, because neither of them was a person who said things directly when they could demonstrate them through action. But it was there in everything. In the way he looked for her first when he came in from outside, cold and relieved, in the way she would put his coffee on before he asked because she had learned exactly when he would need it, in the small jokes that only they understood, in the way the house felt different with two people in it who were glad to be with each other. In February, when the worst of the winter had loosened its grip, and the days were lengthening towards something that might eventually become spring, Cecil Dalton did the thing he had been building toward doing since October. He had been working on a project in the evenings in the barn when Annie thought he was doing ordinary maintenance. And he had been mostly, but he had also been working on a small rocking chair. He was not a skilled woodworker, but he was careful and patient, and the chair was honest work, smooth-sanded, sturdy, with a slight curve to the back that took him 3 attempts to get right. He had found a bit of green velvet ribbon in the bottom of his father's tool chest, which had been there as long as he could remember, and whose origin was entirely unclear, and he had tied it in a small bow on one of the arm supports. He brought it inside on a Sunday evening after she had gone to tidy up from supper and set it by the fire. She came back into the sitting room and saw it and stopped. "Cecil," she said. "It's not much," he said, which was his first and only attempt at deflection, because she turned on him with an expression that made deflection impossible. "Do not say that," she said. "All right," he said. She crossed the room and ran her hand along the smooth arm of the chair, and then she turned and looked at him, and her eyes were bright in the firelight. "You made this." "I did. For me." "Yes." She shook her head slowly, not in disbelief exactly, but in the particular way a person does when something has moved them beyond the available vocabulary. She sat down in the chair, and it fit her well, which he had judged by watching how she sat, measuring without her knowing it. She rocked once, forward and back, and looked up at him. "I love you," she said. The first time either of them had said it plainly, without the armor of implication or the shelter of circumstance. He went still. Then he let out a breath. "I love you, Annie," he said. "I think I have for some time." She reached up and took his hand. They stayed there by the fire for a long while, him standing and her in the chair, their hands joined, the prairie night pressing gentle and cold against the windows. Spring came to the Double D with a particular intensity, as it always did on the southern Kansas plains, as though the land were making up for lost time, erupting in wild flowers and bird song and the thick green smell of fresh grass after the first warm rains. The cattle grew fat on the new pasture. The kitchen garden that Annie had planted in the fall came up in orderly rows through the warming soil, and she added to it, expanding the beds with the focused energy of someone who was finally planting roots in a place she intended to stay. She had made friends in Caldwell over the winter, which Cecil had worried about, and then found he needn't have. Annie Kingsley, Annie Dalton, was the kind of person who made friends not by effort or performance, but simply by being genuinely interested in people, which most people found irresistible. She had developed a warm friendship with the schoolteacher, a young woman named Clara Briggs, who was only slightly younger than Annie, and who shared Annie's habit of plain speech and strong opinion. She had also, somewhat to Cecil's bemusement, become indispensable to Reverend Samuel's small congregation in the way that women of competence and organization tend to become indispensable to institutions that desperately need both. Pete Holbrook and his wife, Martha, who had 2 small children and a ranch that adjoined the Double D on the western side, became their closest neighbors and something very close to family. Martha Holbrook was a warm, expansive woman who had been worried about Cecil for years, and who received Annie with an enthusiasm that was entirely genuine. Pete, who had already seen Annie through Cecil's careful descriptions in letters over the winter, was simply pleased that his friend was happy, which was all Pete had ever really wanted. In April, Pete and Cecil rode out to the far eastern section of the Double D, where the creek ran closest to a shared fence line, to assess some fence repair that the winter had made necessary. They worked through the morning, stretching wire and setting posts, and at one point Pete looked over at Cecil and said, "You look different." "Fence posts tend to do that to a man," Cecil said. "Not the fence posts," Pete said. "You know what I mean." Cecil drove a staple into a post. "She's good for the place," he said. Pete waited. "She's good for me," Cecil admitted. Pete nodded as if this were not news. "Martha said so in November. I'm only just saying it now because you look like you actually know it, which means you finally caught up." Cecil almost smiled and went back to the fence. In June, something happened that tested the ranch, and the people on it in a way that Cecil had not anticipated. There was a man, his name was Roy Sutter, who ran a competing cattle operation about 40 miles to the south, a man of the kind who moved through the world by finding other people's edges and pressing on them. Sutter had been interested in buying a section of the Double D's eastern pasture land for 2 years, and Cecil had declined, and the declinations had not been well received. Sutter rode to the Double D on a June morning with 2 of his hands behind him, which was not strictly threatening, but was meant to imply the possibility of threat, and he presented himself at the ranch house door with a revised offer that was still below what the land was worth, and a manner that suggested he expected compliance. Annie answered the door. Cecil, who was at the back of the property working on a water trough, heard about this later, but the account he received from Annie herself, delivered with complete calm over the lunch table, was sufficient. Sutter had apparently been surprised to encounter a woman. He had explained his purpose in the manner of a man who expected a woman to be unable to understand it or to have any authority to respond. And Annie had understood everything immediately and responded with a precision that had apparently left Sutter somewhat wrong-footed. She had told him that the eastern pasture was not for sale, that Mr. Dalton's position on this matter was well established, and that if Mr. Sutter had further business he was welcome to return at a time when Cecil was available, but that she did not anticipate the answer would be different. "Did he give you any trouble?" Cecil asked, setting down his fork. "He was rude," Annie said, "but rudeness is not trouble." "It's just rudeness." Cecil looked at her. "I'll speak to him." "You may," she agreed, "but I already told him what he needed to know." He did speak to Sutter subsequently in Caldwell in a conversation that was brief and entirely explicit about the status of the eastern pasture and the undesirability of Sutter appearing at the ranch house uninvited in the future. Sutter did not appear again, and the matter ended there, which was the preferable outcome. But Cecil had not been present when Sutter came to the house, and that stayed with him for several days. He had not been there to stand between Annie and something unpleasant, and she had not needed him to be, which was both a relief and a strange kind of humbling. He had married a woman who could handle things, and he needed to make peace with the complicated feelings that produced in a man who had spent a decade thinking his most important job was to handle things himself. "You're not troubled that I spoke to him?" Annie asked one evening, reading his face with the accuracy she had developed over the months. "No," he said, and then, because she deserved more than one syllable, I'm glad you were there. I'm glad you knew what to do. I think I'm still learning what it means to not be alone in this." She set down her sewing. "So am I," she said quietly. "It is a thing that takes practice." He reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, which made her lean slightly into his hand, and the conversation resolved itself without any further words. The summer of 1879 was good to the Double D. The cattle sold well in August. Cecil had 20 new calves from the spring, strong animals, and the prices were favorable. He hired a permanent hand, a young man named Eli Marsh, barely 19 but hardworking and honest, who had come west from Missouri looking for something he couldn't quite name and had found steady employment and what appeared to be a sense of purpose on the Double D's North Pasture. Annie baked Eli a loaf of bread on his first week, and he had been, from that point forward, entirely devoted to the Dalton household in the slightly formal way of young men who don't know how to express gratitude but feel it strongly. In September of 1879, Annie told Cecil she was expecting. She told him at breakfast, with the morning light coming through the kitchen window and his coffee in front of him and Eli already visible through the window heading toward the barn, and she said it quietly and plainly and watched his face. Cecil set down his coffee cup. He looked at her for a moment. Then he got up from the table and went to her and lifted her from her chair and held her close, and she felt him breathe out, long and shaking against her hair. "You're all right," he said, into her hair. "You feel all right." "I feel perfectly fine," she said, "though I believe cornbread is going to be difficult for a few weeks." He laughed, and it was the sound of something breaking open in the best possible way. "Annie," he said. "I know," she said. She held on to him. The kitchen was warm and the coffee was cooling, and outside Eli was doing whatever Eli did in the mornings, and the whole world had shifted on its axis in the most ordinary and extraordinary way possible. "We should write to Martha," Annie said after a while. "We should write to Martha immediately," Cecil agreed. Martha Holbrook arrived that same afternoon, apparently having received intelligence via some frontier communication network that required no actual letter, and she embraced Annie and fussed over her, and then fussed at Cecil for good measure, and stayed for supper. Pete came to fetch her in the evening and shook Cecil's hand with a grip that said everything necessary. The autumn moved around Annie's expanding presence in the house, and Cecil moved with it. He was attentive in a way that he had to consciously balance. She was not fragile and did not appreciate being treated as such, but he was afraid in the private way that men are afraid when the thing they love most in the world is subject to risks that fall outside their ability to manage. He drove her to Wichita in October to see the doctor there, a competent man named Dr. Greer, who examined her and found everything proceeding normally, and told Cecil this in a manner that clearly recognized the level of anxiety present on the father's side of the equation. They came back through the prairie in the late afternoon, the sky going rose and purple to the west, and Annie sat beside him on the wagon seat with her hands in her lap and her face turned to the sky. "Everything is fine," she said. "I know," he said. "You were holding your hat so tightly that I thought you might flatten it." He glanced at the hat on his knee. "That's just how I hold a hat." "It isn't," she said with that dry precision he loved. She put her hand on his arm. "Everything is fine, Cecil." He covered her hand with his. "I know," he said again, more quietly this time, meaning it differently. The winter came, and they moved into it with the particular confidence of people who had already survived one winter together and knew the shape of it. The stores were laid in carefully. The barn was prepared. Eli's quarters, a small room built on the back of the barn that Cecil had improved considerably over the summer, were winterized and stocked. The kitchen garden was put to bed under straw. And Annie, larger now and slower, but no less formidable in her particular way, organized the household against the cold with the thoroughness of a general preparing fortifications. She had finished her mother's letter. She told him one evening had gone back to it and read it through completely, all the way to the end in October on a morning when she had been feeling her mother's absence particularly. She had cried, she said, and then she had felt better, and she had put the letter back in the trunk with the Bible, and the trunk had been folded into the household in the way that things do when a new life incorporates the old one. "What did she say?" Cecil asked, at the end. "If you want to tell me." Annie was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. "She said she hoped that whoever I built my life with was a man who understood what a woman was for. Not for service, she meant, for herself." She looked at him. "She said she hoped I'd find someone worth finding." Cecil held her gaze. "I hope I am," he said. "You are," she said simply. "You have been from the start." The baby was born on the 14th of March, 1880, in the bedroom of the Double D Ranch house, with Dr. Greer present, having made the drive from Wichita the previous day when it became apparent that the birth was close, and with Martha Holbrook also present because Martha had delivered more than one baby in a pinch, and also because Annie had simply asked for her. Cecil spent the labor in the sitting room, which was where he was told to be, and he was possibly the least composed he had ever been in his adult life. He sat and stood and sat again and eventually just paced while Eli, out in the barn out of everyone's way, cleaned tack that was already clean for the third time that evening. A boy. He heard the cry first, through the bedroom door, and the specific quality of that sound, new and insistent, announcing itself to the world, went through him like a current. Martha opened the door. "Mother and son are just fine," she said, with the smile of a woman who had been waiting to say those specific words. Cecil was through the door before she had finished the sentence. Annie was pale and tired in a way that was clearly bone-deep, but she was also entirely herself, alert and present, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, the baby in her arms wrapped in the blue blanket she had sewn herself. She looked up when Cecil came in, and her expression was something he would carry in his chest for the rest of his life. He sat on the edge of the bed, careful, and looked at the baby. The baby had dark hair and a red face and eyes that were the slightly unfocused dark blue of the very newly born, and it was the most extraordinary thing he had ever seen. "He looks like you," Annie said. "God help him," Cecil said, which made her laugh, which made her wince because laughing was apparently uncomfortable at the moment, which made him worry, and then she laughed again at his face. "I am fine," she said. "We are fine. Look at him, Cecil." He looked. He reached out and touched the baby's cheek with one careful finger, the roughness of his hand against that impossibly soft skin, and something happened in his chest that he had no adequate word for. It was love, obviously, but the word seemed too small for what was actually occurring. "What shall we call him?" she asked. They had discussed names both directions and had arrived at several candidates. They had not settled on one, agreeing that they would wait to see. "Thomas," Cecil said. It had been his father's name, his father's middle name, the name his father had gone by in his own childhood before he decided that Thomas sounded too formal for a ranching man and shortened it to Tom, and then Tom had been shortened further by circumstances to the initial, and it was buried somewhere in the man's history, but it was there. Annie looked at him. She understood the meaning immediately. "Thomas," she said. "Thomas what?" "Thomas James," Cecil said. James for Annie's own father, which she had mentioned wanting. Annie looked down at the baby. "Thomas James Dalton," she said quietly. "You will have to be patient with your father, who worries too much, and with your mother, who has opinions about everything. Welcome to Kansas." Cecil put his arm around her, gently, careful of her, and they sat together in the lamplit room on the deep prairie night and looked at this entirely new person they had made, and the world was very large and very manageable all at the same time. Thomas James Dalton grew quickly, in the way that healthy babies on good land with loving parents tend to do, as though he understood the space available to him and intended to fill it. He had his father's gray-blue eyes, as it turned out, though they took some months to settle into their final color, and his mother's directness of expression, which became apparent even before he could speak in the way that his face communicated his assessments of the world with absolute transparency. He was interested in cattle before he could walk properly. He had opinions about the dog, a new dog, a brown and white cattle dog named Juniper who had attached herself to the household the previous spring, that Juniper appeared to find entirely acceptable. Cecil rebuilt the fence along the north pasture in the spring of 1881 and found it easier than it had ever been, not because the work was lighter, but because he came home to something every evening. He came home to Annie at the kitchen table with a lamp and her Bible and a sleeping baby in the small cot nearby, and then later a small boy who was not sleeping at all but who ran to the door when he heard the horse and flung himself at Cecil's legs with a trust so complete it made Cecil's throat tight every single time. He was a better rancher than he had been alone. He was not sure he could explain why exactly, except that the things he was doing it for were clearer, and clarity of purpose makes a person more effective. He expanded the herd deliberately, made careful decisions about the bulls, improved the watering arrangements on the east pasture. He and Pete Holbrook partnered on the fall cattle drive to Wichita, which was more efficient than going separately, and the returns were better 2 years running. Annie expanded the garden to include medicinal herbs, which she had learned from a book she'd ordered from a bookseller in Kansas City, and from Clara Briggs's considerable folk knowledge. She became the household's primary medical resource for the minor ailments that were a constant of ranch life: cuts, bruises, the persistent coughs that came with winter, the sunburns of summer. And she developed a reputation in the area for competence that meant neighboring families occasionally sent to her when Dr. Greer was too far. She also, in the evenings when Thomas was asleep and the ranch was quiet, continued her mother's practice of writing letters. Not correspondence requiring answers necessarily, but the kind of writing a person does to make sense of their experience. In a journal she kept in the trunk beside the Bible and the letter, a new thing that occupied the same space as the old things and seemed right there. One evening in the autumn of 1881, she showed Cecil something she had written. She had never done this before. She showed him a passage she had written about the first time she had seen the ranch, about standing on the covered porch and looking out at the grassland and feeling the size of the place and the possibility of it simultaneously. She had written about it with a clarity and precision that made the reading of it feel like standing in that particular moment, and Cecil read it slowly and carefully and then set the journal on his knee. "You should write more of this," he said. She looked at him. I didn't know if it's remarkable, Annie." She was quiet for a moment in the way she went quiet when something mattered to her. "My mother used to write," she said. "She didn't think of it as anything. I found her journals after she passed. They were extraordinary. I didn't know." A pause. "I didn't want Thomas to not know if it turned out I had anything worth saying." Cecil handed the journal back to her. "Keep writing," he said. She tucked the journal against her chest for a moment with both hands, the way a person holds something they are just beginning to trust the value of, and then set it on the table beside her. The years on the Double D accumulated the way good years do, not without difficulty, because the land was real and the work was real, and neither of them was naive about the nature of a life, but with the particular richness of two people who have found their right place and their right companion and who know it. There were hard seasons. There was a drought in the summer of 1882 that stressed the grazing and required careful management, and some difficult decisions about the herd size. There was a winter in 1883 when Cecil had a chest illness that laid him out for 3 weeks and frightened both of them, and Annie managed the ranch with Eli's help and her own considerable determination, and did not allow Cecil to know how frightened she had been until he was well past it. "You never told me you were worried," he said, when he was recovered and sitting on the porch in the thin February sun, getting his color back. "I was focused on making sure I didn't need to be," she said. He reached for her hand. "I'm sorry I scared you." "Don't get sick again," she said. "I'll make a note of that," he said. She laughed and he laughed, and Thomas, 4 years old, busy, alarmed by nothing, wandered past them onto the porch steps and began an elaborate construction project with several sticks and a great deal of dirt. In the spring of 1884, Annie told Cecil she was expecting again. This time she told him in the garden, where he had come to bring her coffee, because she had been up since before him and he had noticed. She was crouched by the early lettuce, and she looked up at him when he came through the gate, and he could see it in her face before she said it. He set the coffee down on the garden post and crouched beside her in the spring dirt. "Again," she said. "Yes," he said. He pulled her close and she leaned into him, warm in the spring morning, the smell of fresh earth and coffee and the wind off the plains. "Thomas is going to be insufferable," she said into his shoulder. Thomas is 4. He will adjust. He told Juniper last week that she was his dog and no one else could have her. He's not particularly flexible on matters of ownership. He'll be fine, Cecil said. He was smiling. He could feel her smiling too. The second baby came in November 1884, and it was a girl, which Thomas received with the philosophical resignation of a 4-year-old, who has been informed that the world is sometimes surprising. They named her Clara, after Annie's friend Clara Briggs, who wept with pleasure when informed and brought 3 jars of her best preserves and a hand-quilted blanket to the ranch house as a gift. Clara Dalton had her mother's dark hair and her father's tendency towards silence, which in a baby mostly manifested as an unusual quality of observation. She would lie in her cot and regard the world around her with large gray eyes as though she were taking careful notes. Annie found this deeply familiar and looked at Cecil about it once, and he looked back at her and they shared one of the compressed, wordless conversations that long partnership produces, which this one translated to, "She is very like you," and this one responding, "She is very like you too," and both of them were right. By the time Clara was old enough to toddle around the ranch after her brother, the Double D had grown into what Cecil's father had perhaps imagined for it, though could not have lived to see. The herd was larger and better quality. The house had been extended, a room added to the east side, making a proper study where Annie's journals and Cecil's farm records and the Bible and the letter in the trunk could all exist in the same warm space. Eli Marsh, now in his mid-20s and no longer uncertain about what he was looking for, had become indispensable not just as a hired hand but as a person, and Cecil had given him a small but real share in the operation, which Eli had received with the speechless gratitude of someone whose luck has been better than they expected. There was also, by 1885, a real town of Caldwell beginning to happen, not just a cattle trail town, but a place with a school that now had 30 students, a doctor of its own who had settled there, 2 churches, a newspaper, and the complicated civic life of a community deciding what kind of place it intended to be. Annie was part of that civic life in the way that capable people inevitably are, particularly women of intelligence and organization in places that desperately need both. She was involved in the school board, in the church committee, in a reading circle she had helped Clara Briggs establish. She was known, in Caldwell and in the surrounding ranching community, as a woman of sense and substance, Annie Dalton of the Double D, whose kitchen garden was the most productive in the county and whose opinions on anything you cared to name were worth hearing. Cecil, at 38, was exactly what he had wanted to be, a man with a working ranch and a clear conscience and a full house. He still moved through the world with more quiet than speech, and the community knew him for it, knew that his word was good and his judgment sound, and that if Cecil Dalton told you something, it was because he had thought about it first. On a Saturday evening in October 1885, the autumn golden and cool, the kind of Kansas evening that almost made the summer worth it, they sat on the front porch of the Double D together, the 2 of them, because the children were inside with the lamp and their various occupations. Thomas was 7 and reading with a concentration that Annie found deeply satisfying. Clara was barely a year, asleep. Cecil had a coffee. Annie had her journal, though she wasn't writing in it at the moment, just holding it while she looked at the sky. The evening star had appeared over the western rim of the world, first and bright. "Do you remember the first morning?" she said. He thought back. "At the hotel." "At the edge of town," she said, "when you found me looking west. I remember. You said it would start to feel like room instead of emptiness." She looked at the same direction now. The horizon was the same vast, unobstructed, permanent. "You were right." He looked at her profile in the fading light, the serious, beautiful face that he knew better than he knew anything and that he was still, after all this time, discovering. The face that had looked up at him from a Cincinnati woman's letter and said, "I want a life, not a situation," and had meant it exactly and had built it exactly and had made him, in the building, into more than he had been alone. "Annie," he said. She turned. "I am grateful," he said, "every day for all of it." She looked at him for a moment, and then she did the thing she had done on an October evening years ago by the lamp over her mother's letter. She reached across and took his hand. "So am I," she said. The evening deepened around them. From inside the house came the small domestic sounds of a family, a lamp being adjusted, a book being set down, the creak of a floorboard under a child's step. The windmill turned over the well, its steady voice a familiar rhythm. The trunk still sat by the bedroom window where it had always sat. The Bible and the letter were in it still, the letter folded along its old creases, the Bible worn now from years of nightly use, its spine flexible and soft. Annie had added her journals to the trunk over the years, a small stack of them now, filled with the careful record of a life built deliberately on enormous, beautiful, demanding ground. The trunk that had held almost nothing had filled up slowly, the way a life does with everything that mattered. Cecil had found the trunk open one afternoon the previous spring, when Annie was in the garden and he had come inside for something. He had not touched anything in it. He had simply looked, standing in the doorway of the bedroom, at the old black Bible and the folded letter and the stack of small journals, and at the way the afternoon light fell across them, and he had stood there for a moment longer than he intended. He had not wept. That was not quite right, not quite what the moment required to be described accurately. But there had been something very close to it, a fullness that pressed against the back of his eyes and throat, because the trunk represented something he understood in a way that could not be explained simply. The woman he loved had arrived with almost nothing, by choice and by circumstance both, and she had brought the most important things she had, and she had made everything else from scratch here on this land with him. He had stood in the doorway a little longer and then gone quietly out to the porch, and when Annie came in from the garden, flower-dusty, he had taken her face in both his hands and kissed her in the middle of the afternoon, which startled and then delighted her, and she had asked what that was for. "Nothing," he had said. "Cecil Dalton," she said, "you never do anything for nothing." "All right," he said, "for everything." She looked at him with that direct, amber-eyed look that he had first seen across a hotel dining table in the summer of 1878 and had never become accustomed to. "Everything," she repeated. "Yes," he said. She put her flowery hands against his chest. "You are a very strange man," she said fondly. "Yes," he agreed, and she laughed, and the afternoon was a bright and ordinary thing that he would keep. The years kept coming. Thomas grew tall and serious and showed a talent for the cattle work that was equal parts instinct and application. He was 9 years old and already insisting on coming along for the morning checks, practical and careful, and constantly asking the kind of questions that indicated a mind working on the problem. Clara grew into herself with a steady curiosity, watching the world with those quiet gray eyes, collecting rocks and feathers and small interesting facts about everything around her. Annie's journals multiplied quietly. She wrote about everything: the ranch, the seasons, the children, the political situation with the cattle industry as the 1880s advanced, and the open range began to close under the pressure of barbed wire and legislation, and the growing complexity of a frontier that was ceasing, slowly, to be a frontier. She wrote about the Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples and the continued injustice of their situation with a directness that Clara Briggs, who had read some of the journals with Annie's permission, said should be published somewhere that people could read it. Annie laughed at that, but she did not entirely dismiss it. In 1887, a correspondent for a Wichita newspaper came through the area writing a series of pieces on the ranching life of southern Kansas, and someone Pete Holbrook, Cecil always suspected, though he never confirmed it, directed the man to the Double D. The correspondent, a sharp young man named Webb, spent an afternoon talking to Cecil and Annie both, and his article, when it appeared, was mostly about Cecil's management of the ranch but contained 2 paragraphs about Annie that were By Cecil's judgment, the most accurate piece of writing about his wife he had ever encountered outside of her own journals, and he said so. "He didn't get everything right," Annie said, reading it at the kitchen table. "Nobody gets everything right," Cecil said. "He got enough," she allowed. He was watching her read it, this woman he had married from an advertisement and a prayer, and he thought that there was nothing in his life he would not undo to arrive at this kitchen, this table, this woman, this morning. Not the loneliness before her, and not the long labor after, and not the hard seasons or the illness or the drought or any of it, because all of it had led here. He had come to understand something over the years of their life together that he had not understood before. That love on the frontier, real love, sustained love, was not the dramatic variety that the dime novels described and that men were occasionally foolish enough to expect. It was something much more ordinary and much more profound. It was the accumulation of 10,000 ordinary mornings' coffee made before it was asked for, a hand on an arm at exactly the right moment, a joke that only one other person in the world would understand. It was standing together at the edge of a hard season and deciding not to be defeated. It was reading a letter that breaks your heart while the man you love sits across the table making sure you are not alone with it. It was building things, chairs and gardens and children and years, with the same steady seriousness you brought to the fence line, because all of it is the same work, really, making something that will hold. Thomas was 10 years old in 1890, and Clara was 5, and the Double D was running at its best. The herd large and healthy, the house full, the land as productive as land in southern Kansas could be made with care and water and will. Eli Marsh, now 31 and with his own small share of the operation, had built himself a proper house on the north section, and was, to everyone's deep satisfaction, courting a young woman from Caldwell named Ruth Garrett, who happened to be the younger sister of Tommy Garrett, the boy who had carried Annie's trunk to the hotel on that first day. There was something satisfying about that circularity that Annie noted in her journal, and that Cecil, when she showed him, received with the rare full smile that was his most valuable currency. They held a supper at the Double D for Eli and Ruth in the spring. The long table brought out onto the porch Pete and Martha Holbrook, Clara Briggs and her husband, Reverend Samuels, who was aging but still presiding over his small congregation with quiet dedication, and Tommy Garrett himself, now grown and working the cattle trade. The evening was warm and the sky went spectacular shades of rose and gold, and the company was easy, and Cecil sat at the head of his table looking down its length at Annie at the other end, who was laughing at something Martha had said. Her dark hair shot through now with a thread of silver at the temple that she wore with the same unself-consciousness with which she wore everything, and he thought, This was what he had not known to hope for when he had written that advertisement in the stump pencil of his loneliness. This whole extravagant thing. After supper, when the guests had gone and the children were in bed and the night was full of cricket song and the sound of the windmill, Cecil and Annie washed the dishes together in the kitchen, a thing they did most evenings, a small economy of partnership that they had fallen into without discussion, and Annie said, handing him a plate to dry, "Do you know what I was thinking at supper?" "What?" he said. "I was thinking about the trunk," she said. She said it quietly, easily, without the weight the trunk had once carried. "The first time I showed it to you, everything I brought," he dried the plate, "I remember. I was thinking that I still have almost nothing in it," she said. "Just the Bible and the letter and the journals. Nothing much to look at." She handed him another plate. "But I thought about what my mother wrote. That home is what you carry with you. And I thought," she paused, looking at the dishwater, "I thought that the trunk is almost empty, but I am completely full." Cecil set the dry plate carefully on the shelf. He turned and looked at her, this woman, this life, this kitchen, this whole accumulated and astonishing thing. "Yes," he said. She looked up from the dishwater at him. "So am I," he said. She smiled, not the careful, measuring smile of that first afternoon in Caldwell, but the fully open one that she gave only here, only in this house, only to him, and she handed him the last dish. They dried it between them and put it away, and then they went out onto the porch together in the cricket-loud dark. The stars stretched overhead in their great indifferent abundance, and the plains breathing in the dark around them, and they stood together in the good silence that requires no filling, the kind of silence that is its own form of saying everything, and the double D settled into the night around them, whole and full and right. In the spring of 1891, Annie's journals were published. Not by a grand house in New York. That was not how such things happened on the Kansas plains in 1891. Clara Briggs, who had become the editor's assistant at the Caldwell newspaper after her husband had taken over the position, had advocated persistently for printing excerpts, and the new editor had agreed, and what began as a series of 4 pieces in the Caldwell Post had been noticed by a Wichita paper and reprinted, and a correspondent in Wichita had sent them east, and a small but earnest publisher in Cincinnati, of all places, had written to Annie with an offer. She showed Cecil the letter at the kitchen table the morning it arrived. He read it twice, then he set it down. "Cincinnati," he said. "My home city," she said. "Of all the coincidences." He looked at her. He could see the complicated territory of it on her face, the pride she would not fully let herself feel yet, and the uncertainty, and underneath both of those the thing that she would not say, which was that it meant her mother would have been glad. "What will you tell them?" he asked. "I think," she said carefully, "that I will say yes." He nodded. It was the right answer, and he knew it. He also knew that it was not something he was entitled to an opinion about, except inasmuch as her happiness was his happiness, which it entirely was. "Then say yes," he said. She looked at him across the table. "It's because of this place," she said. "Everything I wrote worth reading is because of being here, because of all of it." "It's because of you," he said. "It's always been because of you, Annie." She folded the letter carefully and set it beside the coffee cup. "I think I will go to the garden," she said, which was what she always said when something moved her too much for the kitchen to contain. He watched her go out through the back door into the morning. This woman who had come to him with almost nothing, with a Bible and a letter she couldn't read and the entire future in front of her, and had built the most significant thing he had ever witnessed. He sat a while at the table after she'd gone, in the quiet morning kitchen with its familiar smells of coffee and bread, and the particular wormwood smell of a house that has been lived in well, and he held the simplest possible feeling, which was gratitude, which was not a simple feeling at all. Thomas appeared in the kitchen doorway in his work clothes, ready for the morning check. He was 13 now, long-legged and serious, his gray-blue eyes identical to his father's, his mouth shaped exactly like his mother's. "Papa," Thomas said, "the north pasture gate's come off its pin again." "Get the tools from the barn," Cecil said. "I'll be out directly." Thomas disappeared. Cecil stood up from the table. He put his hat on. He went to the back door and looked out at Annie in the garden, crouched between the summer squash and the morning light, her hands in the good dirt, her face turned slightly into the wind off the plains. He had read her mother's letter once, the morning after Annie had first opened it, when Annie had been in the garden and he had gone into the bedroom for his other boots, and the letter had been on the dresser where Annie had left it. He had not planned to read it. He had simply seen it and picked it up before he thought about whether it was his to read, and then he was reading it. It was a short letter. A woman writing through illness, her hand uneven but her meaning absolutely clear. The last lines, the ones Annie had read him, and then the ones before which Annie had not read aloud, which said, "I hope he is kind to you, my Annie, and I hope you are kind to him, and I hope you both know what you have in each other. That is the whole of it. That is all there is." He had set the letter down and gone out to the porch because the kitchen had become suddenly too small, and he had stood in the morning air and let the feeling of it do what it needed to do. He had not gone back inside until it had passed. He had never told Annie he'd read it. He thought perhaps she knew. She knew most things. He went out now to the north pasture gate, to the ordinary work of the ordinary morning, carrying everything he was made of. The years spread forward from that spring with the particular generosity of years that are built on solid ground. Thomas grew into a young man of 19, capable and steady, who had his mother's eyes and his father's temperament, and who showed no signs of being in any hurry to leave the Double D, which suited both his parents in ways they did not say aloud. Clara, at 14, had bloomed into a bookish and observant girl who was the pride of the Caldwell School and who intended, she informed them with her mother's characteristic directness, to attend a college somewhere, which Annie received with immediate and vocal support and Cecil received with quiet pride, and the private anxiety of a father who could see the horizon already taking his daughter away. Annie's small book, 50 pages of journal excerpts, illustrated with a Kansas artist's pen drawings, published in a modest edition from Cincinnati, had come out in the fall of 1891. It had not made a great fortune. It had made enough, and it had made something better than fortune. It had reached, in the particular way that true things do, exactly the people who needed it. Letters came to the Double D addressed to Mrs. A. Dalton, from women all over Kansas and Missouri and Ohio and beyond, letters that said, "I felt that you were describing my life," or "My mother read your book before she passed and I wanted you to know," or "I am moving west and I was afraid and now I am less afraid." Annie read every one and answered what she could. Cecil read a few of them with her permission, and was not surprised by any of them, because he had known since that first October evening what his wife was capable of producing when she sat with a lamp and a journal and the full weight of her attention. He built her a proper writing desk in the spring of 1892. He was better at woodworking by then, years of practice, of making things for the house and the ranch, and the patience that comes from knowing what you are doing something for. The desk was good work. It fit in the east room under the window, where the morning light came in strongest, and it had a small drawer on the right side and a proper surface, large enough for a journal and a lamp in the coffee cup that was always nearby. Annie stood in the doorway of the east room and looked at it for a long time. "Cecil," she said. "It faces east," he said, "for the morning." She crossed the room and ran her hand along the smooth surface. She opened the small drawer and closed it. She sat down in the chair he had placed with it, a good chair, padded, because a woman who writes needs to be comfortable. She put her hands flat on the desk's surface and looked out the window at the east field, where the spring grass was coming up green and the cattle moved slowly in the distance. She turned and looked at him in the doorway. "You," she said, just the one word. He came into the room and leaned down and kissed her on the forehead, and she caught his hand and held it against her cheek for a moment. "Write something good," he said. "I intend to," she said. He left her to it, pulling the door partway closed, and went out to begin the morning work. Behind him, through the door, he heard after a moment the soft scratch of a pen beginning to move. Thomas was 20 years old in 1900, and the new century arrived with a dust storm and a cold rain, and the sense that things were changing in ways that could not quite be named yet. The open range was long closed now, the cattle industry different in shape and character from what it had been when Cecil had first put out his advertisement from a lonely ranch house. The world was getting louder and faster and less certain of itself, but the Double D's land was still the same land, the same grass, the same enormous sky. Clara had gone to college in Lawrence, a compromise with geography if not with ambition, and was studying literature and history with the focused intensity of someone who has always known what she was doing and is now simply doing it. She wrote long letters home that Annie saved with the same care she gave her own writing. She came home at the holidays and walked the ranch in her good shoes that got muddy immediately and didn't seem to mind, and she and her father sat on the porch in the evenings and talked in the way they had always been able to talk, the quiet, direct way, without performance, which was their particular frequency. "You're all right?" Clara asked him on a Christmas visit evening, looking at him with her mother's directness. "Yes," he said, "I'm very well." "You look older," she said. "I am older," he said. "So are you." She considered this. "The ranch looks good. "It is good." She looked at the horizon. "I like knowing it's here," she said. "Even when I'm in Lawrence, I like knowing this is the thing that is here." "It will be here," he said. She nodded once, satisfied, and they watched the evening come in from the west. In 1903, Annie finished her second book. It was longer than the first, a full accounting of 25 years on the southern Kansas plains, personal and historical, intimate and large, written in the clear, undeflecting prose that was entirely hers. She dedicated it to C.D., who understood what a life was for. She showed Cecil the dedication before it went to the publisher. He read it. He was 56 years old and had not cried since standing on the porch with his father's death a week behind him, but he had to set the page down and walk to the window and look out at the east field for a while. Annie did not say anything. She had learned, over 25 years, exactly when to let him have his silence. When he turned back, she was watching him with those amber-brown eyes that the lamplight still found and transformed. "Is that all right?" she said. "Annie," he said, "is it?" "Yes," he said, "it is." She smiled. He crossed the room and took her in his arms. This woman who had carried almost nothing across the country and built everything from it, who had brought a Bible and a letter, and had filled the world between them with every good thing he had ever known. And he held her in the quiet of the east room, with the afternoon light coming through the window, and the windmill turning over the well, and the whole long, beautiful accounted life of the Double D existing around them. And he said nothing because nothing was needed. And the plains went on to the edge of what could be seen and beyond, patient and enormous and full of room. The trunk sat by the bedroom window, as it always had. The Bible in it, worn soft now with 30 years of nightly handling. The letter, folded along creases that had become almost invisible with time, a mother's handwriting on a page that held the whole instruction for how to make a life. Know what you have. Be kind. That is all there is. And Annie's journals, a full stack of them now, the record of a woman who had arrived with almost nothing and had found that nothing was exactly enough to begin with, because she had brought herself, and that had always been the most important thing in the trunk. Cecil Dalton, rancher, husband, father, the man who had sat alone at a kitchen table and tried to write the truth of himself in a newspaper advertisement, and had somehow, mercifully, written it accurately enough that a woman in Cincinnati had read it and written back. Cecil Dalton was exactly where he had always been going without knowing it. He was home, and so was she.